Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, for our purposes, Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. Time for another show, but I am forced to pre-record today's show. It is, as you may know, Rosh Hashanah, one of the high holy days of the Jewish calendar, and has called me away from the microphone. And of course, because this is a planned absence from the microphone, a major news event has happened. We probably could have waited until Friday to talk about this, but I'm starting to think that we may have to talk about it all day Thursday and all day Friday, and we have a unique opportunity to do so here. Jack Smith, Special Counsel, has filed a rather lengthy pleading. The big, we were looking for 180 pages. It looks like it's about 165 pages, outlining the fact pattern that he hopes will convince Judge Tanya Chutkan to, how shall we say this, to interpret the Supreme Court's direction to her that she conduct a factual finding at the end of which she should make a determination of whether or not the events of January 6th leading up to it and during and after are the sort of non-official undertakings that a president, former president, sitting president, what have you, could in fact be held liable for, with the broad grant of at least the presumption of immunity for actions taken by the president. This was going to require a demonstration that these are outside the scope of official duties, and, well, you know, it's a one-sided story. It's just Jack Smith's stories, but it's pretty compelling. And people, of course, have been reading through it, excerpting from the document. I, at this point, don't have a comprehensive digest of the entire document as people are reading it now, live, if not tweeting, live posting on social media what they're finding. We have 2 hours before us, and the opportunity to do it without commercials, if need be. I don't even know if we can get all the way through this thing, but I don't know that we have to. My view of it is that he gives us a pretty good look at what's coming up. It is Section 1, that is the factual recitation that will probably be of most interest to us. The legal reasoning could get a little bit dry, but I don't know. I'm not certain how to approach this thing. I had recorded a few other segments. I think I might pocket them. Let's dive in to this motion, the government's motion for immunity determinations in the case of the United States of America versus Donald Trump, defendant. Are you ready? The defendant, that's Donald Trump. And by the way, lots of redactions in this motion and lots of speculation online about who's who. And we should probably try and collect those speculative ideas about who's who so that we have them available to us mentally, even if we can't figure them out on our own. All right, so the defendant, that's Donald Trump, asserts that he is immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because he claims it entailed official conduct. Not so. Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one. Working with a team of private co-conspirators, the defendant acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted, a function in which the defendant, as president, has no official role. I'm going to skip most of the citations here. In Trump v. United States, an earlier proceeding of this very case, the Supreme Court held that presidents are immune from prosecution for certain official conduct, including the defendant's use of the Justice Department in furtherance of his scheme, extraordinarily enough, I would add, as was alleged in the original indictment, and remanded to this court to determine whether the remaining allegations against the defendant are immunized. The answer to that question is no. This motion provides a comprehensive account of the defendant's private criminal conduct, sets forth the legal framework created by the Trump case so far for resolving immunity claims, applies that framework to establish that none of the defendant's charged conduct is immunized because it either was unofficial or any presumptive immunity is rebutted, and requests the relief that the government seeks, which is at bottom this, that the court determine that the defendant must stand trial for his private crimes as would any other citizen. This motion provides the framework for conducting the necessarily fact-bound immunity analysis required by the Supreme Court's remand order. It proceeds in 4 parts. Section 1 provides a detailed statement of the case that the government intends to prove at trial. This includes the conduct alleged in the superseding indictment, as well as other categories of evidence that the government intends to present in its case in chief. This detailed statement reflects the Supreme Court's ruling that presidential immunity contains an evidentiary component, which should be addressed at the outset of a proceeding. Section 2 sets forth the legal principles governing claims of presidential immunity. It explains that for each category of conduct that the Supreme Court has not yet addressed, this court should first determine whether it was official or unofficial by analyzing the relevant content, form, and context, that again a quote from the Supreme Court, to determine whether the defendant was acting in his official capacity instead in his capacity as a candidate for re-election. Where the defendant was acting as an office seeker, not an office holder, no immunity attaches. For any conduct deemed official, the court should next determine whether the presumption of immunity is rebutted, which requires the government to show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. That, too, a quote from the Trump case earlier, itself quoting from Nixon v. Fitzgerald, 1982 case. Section 3 then applies those legal principles to the defendant's conduct and establishes that nothing the government intends to present to the jury is protected by presidential immunity. Although the defendant's discussions with the vice president about their official responsibilities, that's in quotes, qualify as official, again, referring back to the Supreme Court's ruling, the government rebuts the presumption of immunity, and all of the defendant's remaining conduct was unofficial, as content, form, and context all show. The defendant was acting in his capacity as a candidate for re-election, not in his capacity as president. In the alternative, if any of this conduct were deemed official, the government could rebut the presumption of immunity. Finally, Section 4 explains the relief sought by the government and specifies the findings the court should make in a single order, namely, that the defendant's conduct set forth in Section 1 is not immunized, and that as a result the defendant must stand trial on the superseding indictment, and the government is not prohibited at trial from using evidence of the conduct described in Section 1. And now, here is Section 1. First up, a factual proffer. When the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office. With private co-conspirators, the defendant launched a series of increasingly desperate plans to overturn the legitimate election results in 7 states that he had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those are, together, the targeted states. His efforts included lying to state officials in order to induce them to ignore true vote counts, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes in the targeted states, attempting to enlist Vice President Michael R. Pence in his role as President of the Senate to obstruct Congress's certification of the election by using the defendant's fraudulent electoral votes. And when all else had failed, and it all did fail, thank God, on January 6, 2021, directing an angry crowd of supporters to the United States Capitol to obstruct the congressional certification. I would add, of course, that means he set on foot an insurrection against the laws of the United States. But that's not in here. The through line of these efforts was deceit. The defendants and the co-conspirators knowingly false claims of election fraud. They used these lies in furtherance of 3 conspiracies. 1, a conspiracy to interfere with the federal government function by which the nation collects and counts election results, which is set forth in the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act. 2, a conspiracy to obstruct the official proceeding in which Congress certifies the legitimate results of the presidential election. And 3, a conspiracy against the rights of millions of Americans to vote and have their votes counted. At its core, the defendant's scheme was a private criminal effort. In his capacity as a candidate, the defendant used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process, just as he targets every stage of the judicial process right now, I would add, which, through the Constitution, ECA, Electoral Count Act, and state laws, includes the state's notification to the federal government of the selection of their representative electors based on the popular vote in the state, the meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote, and Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding. We, of course, have spent plenty of time going through the mechanics of all of that. As set forth in detail below, the defendant worked with private co-conspirators, including private attorneys, and here we start to hit the redactions. CC1, co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 2, co-conspirator 3. I imagine there's a co-conspirator 4 here that is supposed to be in this 4th block, and of course, a 5th, co-conspirator 5. Those are all private attorneys and private political operatives, co-conspirators 6 and P1, person 1. That's I guess, person 1. And I've already seen speculation on who P1 is. For your edification, that is imagined to be Steve Bannon. But we'll get around to all of that, and I think context will make it clear for all of us. The defendant also relied heavily on private agents, such as his campaign employees and volunteers, like campaign manager P2, whoever the campaign manager was at that time, deputy campaign manager P3, senior campaign advisor P4, and campaign operative P5. In this section, the government sets forth detailed facts supporting the charges against the defendant before addressing in the next section why none of this conduct is subject to immunity under the Supreme Court's decision in the earlier Trump case. The conduct set forth below includes the defendant's formation of the conspiracies leading up to and immediately following the 2020 presidential election, certain information regarding his knowledge that there had not been an outcome determinative fraud in the election, as he persistently claimed, and his increasingly desperate efforts to knowingly false claims of election fraud to disrupt the electoral process. The government does not consider any of the following conduct to be subject to immunity for the reasons set forth in Section 3. But what are these conducts? They are outlined here. A, the formation of the conspiracies. Although his multiple conspiracies began after Election Day in 2020, the defendant laid the groundwork for his crimes well before then. Leading into the election, the defendant's private and campaign advisors, including P6, than a private citizen, it notes, a good hint, and P2, the defendant's campaign manager, informed him that it would be a close contest and that it was unlikely to be finalized on Election Day, in part because of the time needed to process large numbers of mail-in ballots prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. They also told the defendant that the initial returns on election night might be misleading. That is, that he might take an early lead in the vote count that would diminish as mail-in ballots were counted because his own supporters favored in-person voting, while supporters of his opponent, Joseph R. Biden, perhaps you've heard of him, favored mail-in ballots. Privately, the defendant told advisors, including Person 6, campaign personnel, Person 7, a White House staffer and campaign volunteer, and Person 8, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, that's pretty specific, that in such a scenario, he would simply declare victory before all the ballots were counted and any winner was projected. Publicly, the defendant began to plant the seeds for that false declaration. In the months leading up to the election, he refused to say whether he would accept the election results. Well, that sounds familiar. Insisted that he could lose the election only because of fraud. Falsely claimed that mail-in ballots were inherently fraudulent and asserted that only votes counted by Election Day were valid. For instance, now some real-life examples of this stuff in bullet point form. First, in an interview on July 19th, 2020, when asked repeatedly if he would accept the results of the election, the defendant said he would, quote, have to see, and it depends. On July 30th, despite having voted by mail himself earlier that year, the defendant suggested that widespread mail-in voting provided cause for delaying the election, tweeting, quote, with universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote? 3 question marks. Next bullet. In an interview on August 2nd, the defendant claimed without any basis that there is no way you can go through a mail-in vote without massive cheating. At a campaign event in Wisconsin on August 17th, the defendant told his supporters, the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election, so we have to be very careful. In his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention on August 24th, this is a long time in advance, right? The defendant said that the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. On October 27th, during remarks regarding his campaign, the defendant said it would be very, very proper and very nice if a winner were declared on November 3rd instead of counting ballots for 2 weeks. Everything's 2 weeks with him, which is totally inappropriate. And I don't believe that that's by our laws. I don't believe that. So we'll see what happens. The defendant said this despite, or perhaps because, his private advisors had informed him that it was unlikely that the winner of the election would be declared on November 3rd. By October 2020, Person 1, everybody says Steve Bannon, a private political advisor who had worked for the defendant's 2016 presidential campaign, began to assist with the defendant's re-election effort. 3 days before Election Day, P1, Bannon, described the defendant's plan to a private gathering of supporters. I think we remember him doing this. And it's a quote, and what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. That doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. That's pretty clear. After explaining that Biden's supporters favored voting by mail, Person 1 stated further, and so they're going to have a natural disadvantage, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. Immediately following Election Day on November 3rd, the defendant did exactly that. As his private and campaign advisors had predicted to him in certain states, the defendant took an early lead on Election Day that began to erode. At approximately 11:20 p.m., Fox News projected that Biden would prevail in the state of Arizona And according to campaign advisor P4, he and the defendant were shocked and angry at this development. As Election Day turned to November 4th, the contest was too close to project a winner. And in discussions about what the defendant should say publicly regarding the election, senior advisors suggested that the defendant should show restraint while counting continued. Two private advisors, however, advocated a different course. Co-conspirators 1 and 6 suggested that the defendant just declare victory. And at about 2:20 a.m., because he never sleeps, I guess, the defendant gave televised remarks to a crowd of his campaign supporters in which he falsely claimed, without evidence or specificity, that there had been fraud in the election and that he had won. This is a fraud on the American people, the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election. In the immediate post-election period, while the defendant claimed fraud without proof, his private operatives sought to create chaos rather than seek clarity at polling places where states were continuing to tabulate votes. For example, on November 4th, Person 5, a campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator of the defendant, tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan looked unfavorable for the defendant. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told Person 5, quote, "We think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right," Person 5 responded, "Find a reason it isn't." Wow, that's very reminiscent to the Brad Raffensperger call and all the motive behind it. Find a reason it isn't. Give me options to file litigation. And even if it is, that is to say, give me a reason to file litigation, even if it is right. And then a couple of typos in there. When a colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, they actually call it the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort, if you remember, to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2000 presidential election. Let's just keep stealing elections for Republicans, why don't we? Person 5 responded, "Make them riot and do it!" 3 exclamation points at that. Okay, setting on foot an insurrection. The defendant's campaign operatives and supporters used similar tactics at other tabulation centers, including in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the defendant sometimes used the resulting confrontations to falsely claim that his election observers were being denied proper access. They're not being allowed to riot. Denied proper access, thus serving as a predicate to the defendant's claim that fraud must have occurred in the observer's absence. Contrary to the defendant's public claims of victory immediately following Election Day, his advisors informed him that he would likely lose. On November 7th, in a private campaign meeting that included Person 2, Person 3, Person 4, and White House staffer Person 9, who came to serve as a conduit for information from the campaign to the defendant, campaign staff told the defendant that he had only a slim chance of prevailing in this election and that any potential success was contingent on the defendant winning all ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, on November 13th, the defendant's campaign conceded its litigation in Arizona, meaning that based on his campaign advisor's previous assessment, the defendant had lost the election. That same day, in an implicit acknowledgement that he had no lawful way to prevail, the defendant sidelined the existing campaign staff responsible for mounting his legal election challenges from Person 2, Person 3, and others who were telling the defendant the truth that he did not want to hear, that he had lost. The defendant turned, instead to co-conspirator 1, a private attorney who was willing to falsely claim victory and spread knowingly false claims of election fraud. That could be any number of their private attorneys, of course. As the defendant placed alternating phone calls to person 3 and co-conspirator 1 throughout November 13th. Person 1, Bannon, informed co-conspirator 6, another private campaign advisor, of the change, writing, "Close hold, don't tell anyone. Trump just fired person 3 and put co-conspirator 1 in charge. And you are to report to co-conspirator 1. When co-conspirator 6 asked if person 2 was gone too, person 1 replied that they all report to co-conspirator 1 and that person 1 had made a recommendation directly that if co-conspirator 1 was not in charge of this thing, it's over. Not in charge of this thing is over. Trump is into the end. The next day, consistent with person 1's description, the defendant announced his staff change by tweet, writing, "I look forward to co-conspirator 1 spearheading the legal effort to defend our right to free and fair elections." You should be able to look that tweet up and figure out who co-conspirator 1 is now. Co-conspirator 1, person 10, person 11, co-conspirator 3, and person 12 are truly a great team added to our other wonderful lawyers and representatives. I wonder if we can't take a quick peek and see who those people are in that tweet. Okay, I've just had a quick look on Twitter, and I found that tweet of November 14th, 2020. So just so we can read that side by side, I look forward to Mayor Giuliani. That would be our co-conspirator 1. Mayor Giuliani spearheading the legal effort to defend our right to free and fair elections. Rudy Giuliani, and now person 10, Joseph DeGeneva, and person 11, Victoria Tensing. And let's see, next up is co-conspirator 3, that's Sidney Powell, and person 12, that is Jenna Ellis, a truly great team added to our other wonderful lawyers and representatives. So there you have it. Let's fill in those blanks on our roster. Now we're on to section B here. The defendant knew that his claims of outcome determinative fraud were false. Following Election Day and throughout the charged conspiracies, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These lies included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as that large numbers of dead, non-resident, non-citizen, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden, and the defendant and co-conspirators continued to make these unsupported, objectively unreasonable, and ever-changing claims even after they had been publicly disproven or after advisors had directly informed the defendant that they were untrue. The evidence demonstrates that the defendant knew his fraud claims were false because he continued to make those claims even after his close advisors, acting not in an official capacity but in a private or campaign-related capacity, told him they were not true. These advisors included P9, person 9, the White House staffer and campaign conduit, and Pence, the defendant's running mate. Person 9's relationship with the defendant began before Person 9 worked for him in the White House. Person 9 had known Person 13, the defendant's son-in-law, since Person 13 was a child. Well, we know who Person 13 is, the defendant's son-in-law, so let's make a note here. Person 13, Jared Kushner. Okay. Who knew him since he was a child? Well, P9. We'll figure that out later, perhaps. And through person 13, Jared Kushner met person 14 and then the defendant. Person 9 was one of several attorneys who represented the defendant in his first impeachment trial. That's pretty narrow. In the Senate in 2019 and 2020, including presenting argument on the Senate floor on January 27th, 2020. That ought to make it pretty easy, right? Let's find out who that is, just with a quick look. All right, so just for the record, I guess there's a lot of speculation out there, but Chris Geidner's, at least while I'm recording, his current speculation is that P9 is one Eric Hirschman, saying that the dates for joining the White House and speaking on the Senate floor during the first impeachment trial match. P9 began working in the White House as an assistant to the president in August of 2020. In October of 2020, P9, perhaps Eric Hirschman, became interested in learning more about the defendant's campaign, really. And in early November 2020, after he began interfacing with campaign staff, P9, Hirschman, consulted with the White House counsel's office to ensure he complied with any applicable laws regarding campaign activity. Oh, now he's actually worried about that, huh? Okay. Well, thereafter and throughout the post-election period, P9 became a conduit of information from the campaign to the defendant, and over the course of the conspiracies, P9 told the defendant the unvarnished truth, congratulations, about his campaign legal team and the claims of fraud that they and the defendant were making. Well, that might explain why we hardly ever hear of him in all of this. He is telling him the truth and probably got distanced from Trump as soon as he was able. So examples of these instances include, and again, some bullet points here, Hirschman repeatedly gave the defendant his honest assessment that Giuliani could not mount successful legal challenges to the election. For instance, when the defendant told Hirschman that he was going to put Giuliani in charge of the campaign's legal efforts, but pay him only if he succeeded, Hirschman told the defendant he would never have to pay Giuliani anything. In response, the defendant laughed and said, "We'll see." And he didn't, I guess. Thereafter, in the Oval Office meetings with the defendant, Giuliani and others, in which Giuliani made speculative claims, Hirschman told Giuliani in front of the defendant that Giuliani would be unable to prove his allegations in a courtroom. In a separate private conversation, when Hirschman reiterated to the defendant that Giuliani would be unable to prove his false fraud allegations in court, the defendant responded, "The details don't matter." How interesting is that? And by the way, 60 times in a row, no one able to prove any of these things. In the post-election period, Hirschman also took on the role of updating the defendant on a nearly daily basis on the campaign's unsuccessful efforts to support any fraud claims. P9, Hirschman, told the defendant that the campaign was looking into his fraud claims and had even hired external experts to do so, but could find no support for them. He told the defendant that if the campaign took these claims to court, they would get slaughtered because the claims are all what, Greg?
That's bullshit.
That's exactly right. Hirschman was privy in real time to the findings of the two expert consulting firms the campaign retained to investigate fraud claims. That would be C1 and C2. Not sure who they are, but perhaps we'll figure it out before the end of the day, and discussed with the defendant their debunkings on all major claims. For example, Hirschman told the defendant that Georgia's audit disproved claims that C3 had altered votes. Okay. In the post-election time period, Pence, the defendant's own running mate, who he had directed to assess fraud allegations, told the defendant that he had seen no evidence of outcome-determinative fraud in the election. This was in one of the many conversations the defendant and Pence had as running mates in which they discussed their shared electoral interests. Pence gradually and gently tried to convince the defendant to accept the lawful results of the election, even if it meant they lost. These conversations included, more bullet points, a conversation on November 4th in which the defendant asked Pence to study up claims of voter fraud in states that they had won together in 2016 to determine whether they could bring legal challenges as candidates in those states. But Pence described the conversation as follows. Well, I think it was broadly, it was just look at all of it. Let me know what you think. But he told me that the campaign was going to fight, was going to go to court and make challenges. And then he just said, we're going to fight this and take a look at it. Let me know what you think. Another bullet point, a call between the defendant and Pence on November 7th, the day that media organizations began to project Biden as the winner of the election. Pence tried to encourage the defendant as a friend, reminding him, "You took a dying political party and gave it a new lease on life. Buck up. You screwed up the Republican Party, but hey, we'll say that's a good thing for now." A November 11th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence asked when most of the lawsuits would be resolved. "When does this come to a head?" he asked. And the campaign staff responded, "The week after Thanksgiving." A November 12th, 2 weeks, essentially, isn't it? A November 12th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence recalls the campaign lawyers gave a sober and somewhat pessimistic report on the state of the election challenges. A private lunch on November 12th, in which Pence reiterated a face-saving option for the defendant: don't concede, but recognize the process is over. A private lunch on November 16th, in which Pence tried to encourage the defendant to accept the results of the election and run again in 2024, to which the defendant responded, "I don't know, 2024 is so far off." Well, here we are, and you're on trial. Anyway, a November 23rd phone call in which the defendant told Pence that the defendant's private attorney, person 76 here, we'll have to find out who that is, was not optimistic about the election challenges. A December 21 private lunch, 21st, private lunch, more of these private lunches, in which Pence encouraged the defendant, quote, not to look at the election as a loss, just an intermission. He's a great pep talker, isn't he? This was followed later in the day by a private discussion in the Oval Office in which the defendant asked Pence, "What do you think we should do?" Pence said, "After we have exhausted every legal process in the courts and Congress, if we still came up short, the defendant, you should take a bow." Yeah, and then exit the stage. Discussions in which Pence, this is the last bullet point here, apprised the defendant of conversations he had with governors in Arizona and Georgia in the context of election challenges, in which Pence had called the governors simply to gather information and share it with the president, in which the governors did not report evidence of fraud in the elections in their states, and explained that they could not take actions to convene their states' legislatures. But the defendant disregarded Person 9, Hirschman, and Pence in the same way that he disregarded dozens of court decisions that unanimously rejected his and his allies' legal claims, and that he disregarded officials in the targeted states, including those in his own party, who stated publicly that he had lost and that his specific fraud allegations were false. Elections officials, for instance, issued press releases and other public statements to combat the disinformation that the defendant and his allies were spreading. At one point, long after the defendant had begun spreading false fraud claims, Person 15, a White House staffer traveling with the defendant, overheard him tell family members that, quote, "It doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell." The defendant and his co-conspirators also demonstrated their deliberate disregard for the truth, and thus their knowledge of falsity, when they repeatedly changed the numbers in their baseless fraud allegations from day to day. At trial, the government will introduce several instances of this pattern in which the defendant and conspirators' lies were proved by the fact that they made up figures from whole cloth. One example concerns the defendant and conspirators' claims about non-citizen voters in Arizona. The conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was, a quote here, beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote. What? Okay. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000, right? Oh, so I see. Beyond credulity that it wasn't the case that at least a few 100,000 illegals or non-citizens, didn't vote. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000. 36, now 50. The reality, and he then goes on to say, is about 250,000. Oh, wow. Days after that, the assertion was back down to 32,000, and ultimately the conspirators landed back where they started, at 36,000, a false figure that they never verified or corroborated. Ultimately, the defendant's steady stream of disinformation in the post-election period culminated in the speech that he gave at a privately funded, privately organized rally at the Ellipse on the morning of January 6th, 2021. You know the one, which they, again, take time to point out, privately funded, privately organized, in advance of the official proceeding in which the Congress was to certify the election in favor of Biden. In his speech, the defendant repeated the same lies about election fraud in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that had been publicly or directly debunked. Defendant used these lies to inflame and motivate the large and angry crowd of his supporters to march, to set them on foot, to march to the Capitol and disrupt the certification proceedings. Section C. The defendant aimed deceit at the targeted states to alter their ascertainment and appointment of electors. Now, when we're getting into ascertainment, we're talking about the actual mechanics of the certification of the documents that have arrived at the Capitol and at the National Archives and at the courthouses around the country, documenting for whom the electoral votes were cast. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant began to target the electoral process at the state level by attempting to deceive state officials and to prevent or overturn the legitimate ascertainment and appointment of Biden's electors. As president, the defendant had no official responsibilities related to the state's administration of the election or the appointment of their electors, and instead contacted state officials in his capacity as a candidate. There was no excuse to be contacting them as the president. No reason. Tellingly, the defendant contacted only state officials who were in his political party and were his political supporters, and only in states he had lost. The defendant's attempts to use deceit to target the state's electoral process played out in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, as well as across these and other states that used certain voting machines. Wink, wink. In addition to the following evidence of the defendant's conduct during the charged conspiracies at trial, the government will elicit testimony from election officials from the targeted states to establish the objective falsity and often impossibility of the defendant's fraud claims. Notably, although these elections officials would have been the best sources of information to determine whether there was any merit to specific allegations of election fraud in their states, the defendant never contacted any of them to ask. Isn't that something? What a great investigation he conducted. First, Arizona. The defendant was on notice that there was no evidence of widespread election fraud in Arizona within a week of the election. And remember how much time and money they wasted on, cyber ninjas? On November 9th, for instance, 2 days after the news networks projected that Biden had won, the defendant called Arizona Governor Person 16. So what's his name? Doug Ducey? Was that the governor of Arizona at the time? To ask him what was happening at the state level with the presidential vote count in Arizona. At that point, though Fox News had projected that Biden had won the state, several other news outlets, including ABC, NBC, CNN, and the New York Times, had not yet made a projection. Person 16, and I think that's Ducey, right? Do I have that right? Do I have the correct person in mind? I'm trying to remember this. offhand. Arizona. Okay, so Doug Ducey. We continue on then. P16. Maybe I'll just do the numbers and you fill them in your head. All right. Well, anyway, P16 here. Ducey walked the defendant through the margins and the votes remaining to be counted, which were primarily from Pima County, which favored Biden, and Maricopa County, which was split. Almost everybody in Arizona is in those two counties. Person 16 described the situation to the defendant as the ninth inning, 2 outs, and the defendant was several runs down. The defendant also raised claims of election fraud, and thereafter, Ducey asked the defendant to send him supporting evidence. Although the defendant said he would, stating, "We're packing it up," he never did. That's very much like him. 2 weeks. Shortly thereafter, on November 13th, campaign manager P2 told the defendant directly that a false fraud claim that had been circulating, that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona, was false. Whoops. Well, too bad about that one, yeah. That same day, as noted previously, campaign attorneys conceded in court that the remaining election lawsuit in Arizona was moot. The defendant and co-conspirator one, that's Giuliani, continued to try to influence Ducey. For example, Giuliani tried to contact Ducey on November 22nd, the same day the defendant and Giuliani reached out to the Arizona Speaker of the House, as described below. And on November 30th, the day Ducey signed the Arizona Certificate of Ascertainment, formally declaring Biden's electors as the legitimate electors for Arizona, Ducey received a call from the defendant and Pence. I think that happened on TV, right? Ducey advised them that Arizona had certified the election. When the defendant brought up fraud claims, Ducey, eager to see the evidence, again asked the defendant to provide it, but the defendant never did. Instead, later that evening and into the following morning, the defendant repeatedly publicly attacked Ducey, as well as Georgia Governor P17, that's Brian Kemp, on Twitter, retweeting posts by others, such as, quote, "Who needs Democrats when you have Republicans like, P17 and P16? You remember who they are. Watching the Arizona hearings and then watching Governor Ducey sign those papers. And didn't Trump call him in the middle? Why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is Ducey and Kemp? Kemp, my state ran the most corrupt election in American history," he's pretending. And then Ducey is supposedly saying, "Hold my beer." That makes it into the brief here, and Kavanaugh should appreciate that one. And why is Ducey still pretending he's a member of the Republican Party after he just certified fraudulent election results in Arizona that disenfranchised millions of Republicans? You get the idea? The defendant and co-conspirators also attempted to use false fraud claims to convince political allies in the Arizona state legislature to ignore the popular vote and appoint illegitimate electors on November 22nd. The defendant and Giuliani called Person 18, the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives. You could look it up. Giuliani did most of the talking. During the call, the defendant and Giuliani levied multiple false fraud claims, including of non-citizen, non-resident, and dead voters that affected the defendant's race, and asked Person 18 to use them as a basis to call the state legislature into session to replace Arizona's legitimate electors with illegitimate ones for the defendant. When Person 18 voiced his deep skepticism, Giuliani said, "Well, we're all kind of Republicans and we need to be working together." Glug, glug, glug. Person 18 refused and asked Giuliani to provide evidence supporting his fraud claims. Giuliani never did. Indeed, Giuliani met with Person 18 in person approximately a week later and still had nothing to back up his claims. On November 30th, Giuliani, Person 12, and others arrived in Arizona for a hotel hearing, that's in quotes there, an unofficial meeting with Republican legislators during which they promoted false fraud allegations. In a meeting the day after the so-called hearing, when state legislators pressed Giuliani and Person 12 for evidence to support their claims. Who was Person 12? We didn't know that one. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's Jenna Ellis. So lunatic that she is, she goes with Giuliani to Arizona. And when they were asked for evidence to support their claims, Giuliani conceded that even on that late date, we don't have the evidence, but we have lots of theories. The concept of a theory anyway, right? When the legislators were frustrated that Giuliani had no support for his claims and asked him tough questions, Giuliani expressed surprise at the way he was being treated, saying, "Man, I thought we were all Republicans. This is a little more hostile a reception. I'm amazed at the reception I'm getting here." But he still had nothing. On December 4th, Person 18, our Speaker of the House in Arizona, I think, right? Released a public statement in which he explained that he did not have the authority to use the legislature to reverse the results of the election, and that doing so would constitute an attempt to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud. Person 18 made clear that he was disappointed with the legitimate election results because he had voted for President Trump and worked hard to re-elect him. He should be disappointed in that. But he would not violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. On Twitter, Person 19, a campaign staffer who worked with co-conspirator 6, do we know that one? Not offhand, attacked Person 18 for his statement, writing that Person 18 is intentionally misleading the people of Arizona to avoid the inevitable. Oh, I don't think so. The defendant retweeted Person 19's false post and praised her. A month later, just 2 days before January 6th, co-conspirator 2, another of the defendant's private attorneys and a co-conspirator, called Person 18 and Person 18's counsel, Person 20, and urged Person 18 one last time to use the legislature to decertify Arizona's legitimate electors and overturn the valid election results. When Person 18 told co-conspirator 2 that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona and that he could not legally call the legislature into session, co-conspirator 2, and I don't believe we've had a name passed around for that one yet, was undeterred. He conceded that he didn't know enough about the facts on the ground regarding fraud in Arizona and said that Person 18 should nonetheless falsely claim that he had the authority to convene the legislature and let the courts sort it out. Person 18 again refused. We should be talking more about Person 18, I guess. In the post-election period, Person 18 was harassed. On several occasions, individuals gathered outside Person 18's home with bullhorns and screamed and honked their vehicle horns to create noise. Once, an individual in visible possession of a pistol, oh no, not in Arizona, and wearing a T-shirt in support of a militia group came onto Person 18's property and screamed at him. At the time of these events, Person 18's daughter was at home and was very ill, and the noise caused her disruption and angst. Well, I don't know how exaggerated that really is, but the guy shouldn't have been there, and it was ridiculous for the whole thing to have happened. But imagine this. I can't do it. And immediately, MAGA world descends to make threats against his family. Next up, Georgia. And guess what? Similar stuff happening in Georgia. But, of course, Giuliani loses the big fraud case and harassment case in Georgia on top of it all. Let's see what they got to say. The defendant had early notice that his claims of election fraud in Georgia were false. Around mid-November, campaign advisor P4, Person 4, told the defendant that his claim that a large number of dead people had voted in Georgia was false. The defendant continued to press the claim anyway, including in a press appearance on November 29th, when he suggested that a large enough number of dead voters had cast ballots to change the outcome of the election in Georgia. 4 days later, on December 3rd, Giuliani orchestrated a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate. In the morning, in advance of it, Giuliani had spoken to the defendant on the phone for almost 20 minutes. And at the hearing, Giuliani arranged for co-conspirators and agents to repeat the false dead voter claim. The claim was so patently false that everyone around the defendant knew it. During the hearing, Chief of Staff, Person 21, and Person 9. Did we have a guess on that? Oh, yeah, that was Eric Hirschman again. Exchanged text messages on their personal phones confirming that a campaign attorney, Person 22, had verified that Giuliani's claim of more than 10,000 dead voters was false and that the actual number was around 12 and could not be outcome determinative. And of course, those are very often people who cast absentee ballots and then die. During the subcommittee hearing, the conspirators also set in motion a sensational and dangerous lie about election workers at State Farm Arena that would result in the defendant's supporters harassing and threatening those workers, not unlike harassing and threatening the Speaker of the House in Arizona, but with much more serious consequences. First, person 23, one of defendant's private attorneys, claimed that more than 10,000 dead people had voted in Georgia. Next, person 24, an agent of the defendant, played misleading excerpts of closed-circuit camera footage from State Farm Arena and insinuated that it showed election workers committing misconduct, counting, quote, suitcases of illegal ballots. Lastly, based on the false fraud allegations, co-conspirator 2, who had already been engaged as a private lawyer for the defendant but did not disclose that at the hearing, encouraged the Georgia legislators to decertify, whatever that might even mean, decertify the state's legitimate electors. While the hearing was ongoing, the defendant simultaneously amplified the misinformation about the State Farm Arena election workers, falsely tweeting, quote, "Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming. But this alone leads to an easy win of the state." He did this just after retweeting 2 of his campaign accounts' tweets that promoted the false claim about election workers at State Farm Arena. Over the next week, the claim of misconduct at State Farm Arena was disproven publicly as well as directly to the defendant. The day after the hearing, person 25, the chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, posted a tweet explaining that the Secretary of State officers had watched the video in its entirety and confirmed that it showed normal ballot processing. Person 25 again forcefully debunked the conspirators' claims about the State Farm video in a press conference on December 7th, explaining at length the election workers' innocent conduct depicted in the closed-circuit camera footage and stating, quote, "And what's really frustrating is the president's attorneys had this same videotape. They saw the exact same things the rest of us could see, and they chose to mislead state senators and the public about what was on that video. I'm quite sure that they will not characterize the video if they try to enter it into evidence, because that's the kind of thing that could lead to sanctions, because it's obviously untrue. They knew it was untrue, and they continue to do things like this." On December 8th, the defendant called Georgia Attorney General, person 26, who's the Attorney General there? I can't remember offhand. Person 26 had advance notice that the topic of the call was Texas versus Pennsylvania, an election lawsuit in which Texas was suing other states, including Georgia, to attempt to prevent the certification of the election. U.S. Senator person 27 told person 26 that the defendant had heard that person 26 was whipping or lobbying other state attorneys general against filing amicus briefs in support of Texas. Person 26 was not lobbying against the suit and told person 27 so. Person 27 asked person 26 if he would speak with the defendant about it, and person 26 agreed. Did I read that out? So person 27 is a U.S. senator. Which one? Lindsey Graham? I don't know. Shortly thereafter, the defendant called person 26 and immediately raised Texas versus Pennsylvania, saying, "I hope you're not talking to your AGs and encouraging them not to get on the lawsuit." Person 26 told the defendant that he was not affirmatively calling other state attorneys general, but that if they called him, he was telling them what he was seeing in his state, which was something that the defendant probably did not want to hear. Person 26 was just not seeing evidence of fraud in Georgia. The defendant nonetheless raised various fraud claims. Person 26 told him that state authorities had investigated the State Farm Arena allegations and found no wrongdoing. At that, he thought another claim the defendant raised about Coffee County, Georgia, had been similarly resolved, but would check. The defendant asked Person 26 to look at them again because we're running out of time. Person 26 tried to steer the call to an end by thanking the defendant and telling him that he had voted for him twice and appreciated the defendant, to which the defendant responded, "Yeah, I did a hell of a job, didn't I?" At one point, the defendant raised with Person 26 the impending runoff election for Georgia's U.S. Senate seats and how important it was to re-elect Person 27 and Person 28. And so therefore, that is Perdue, right? Number 27. And I guess Kelly Loeffler, number 28. Or was Loeffler? Well, Loeffler, I can't remember if she was incumbent because she had been appointed at that point. But it sounds like Perdue, number 27. Is that the right name? Gosh, I forget these guys already. The day after the call, the defendant, in his private capacity as candidate for president, intervened in support of Texas versus Pennsylvania. His attorney, for that matter, was co-conspirator 2. On the same day as the defendant's call with Person 26, the defendant's campaign staff acknowledged that the State Farm Arena claim was unsupported, emailing one another about the fact that television networks may decline to run campaign advertisements promoting it. In frustration regarding the claim and others like it, Person 4, who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were false, wrote, "When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force team," remember them, "you can see why we're 0-32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy bleep beamed down from the mothership." Wow, I bleeped myself on that one. On December 10th, however, Giuliani further perpetuated the false State Farm Arena claim when he appeared at another hearing, this one before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. During it, he displayed some of the same footage as had been used in the December 3rd hearing that had been debunked by in the interim by Georgia officials, and nonetheless claimed that it showed, quote, voter fraud right in front of people's eyes. He then named 2 election workers, and here we'll not specifically remind you of their names, I guess, Person 29 and her mother, Person 30, and baselessly accused them of quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of heroin or cocaine. You remember this? And suggested that they were criminals whose places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. As these false claims about Persons 30 and 29 spread, the women were barraged by racist death threats. Thanks, Rudy. In the years since, they've spoken about the effect of the defendant and the co-conspirators' lies about them. As Person 30 explained in an interview with congressional investigators, when someone as powerful as the President of the United States eggs on a mob, and that happened, right? That mob will come. They came for us with their cruelty, their threats, their racism, and their hats. Everyone knows what hats those are, right? They haven't stopped, even today. Indeed, to this day, the defendant has never stopped falsely attacking Person 30 and Person 29. Although none of the false claims against them were ever corroborated, the defendant has continued to levy them on social media, including when the defendant attacked Person 30 in January of 2023, just after her testimony to congressional investigators was made public. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant used Twitter to publicly attack Georgia Governor, that's Kemp, Person 17, with particular aggression. In the 35 days between November 30th, 2020 and January 3rd, 2021, the defendant tweeted critically about Kemp by name or title more than 40 times. The tweets included the ones also attacking Person 16. Who was that? That was Ducey, described above, as well as other particular to Kemp, like, why won't Governor Kemp, the hapless governor of Georgia, oh, this is Trump, right, use his emergency powers, which can be easily done, to override his obstinate Secretary of State and do a match of signatures on envelopes? It will be a goldmine of fraud, and we will easily win the state. I will easily and quickly win Georgia if Governor Kemp or the Secretary of State permit a single signature verification. Has not been done and will show large-scale discrepancies. Why are these two, quote, Republicans saying no? If we win Georgia, everything else falls into place. The Republican governor of Georgia refuses to do signature verification, which would give us an easy win. What's wrong with this guy? What is he hiding? And how does Governor Kemp allow certification of votes without verifying signatures? And despite the recently released tape of ballots being stuffed, his poll numbers have dropped like a rock. He is finished as governor. In the post-election period, the defendant also made false claims in court about fraud in Georgia unsuccessfully. For example, in Trump v. Kemp, a federal lawsuit in which the defendant sued Georgia's governor and secretary of state, the defendant signed a verification of fraud allegations that he and his attorney on the case, co-conspirator 2, knew was inaccurate. Person 9, and I think that's our Hirschman, right, spoke with the defendant and co-conspirator 2 in late December regarding the proposed verification. First, he told co-conspirator 2 and another private attorney, person 31, that they could not have the defendant sign it because they could not verify any of the facts. And Hirschman told the defendant that any lawyer that signed that complaint that the verification supported would get disbarred. Co-conspirator 2 acknowledged this problem in an email on December 31st to person 32, lead counsel for the defendant as candidate in Trump v. Kemp, and another private attorney, writing that in the time since the defendant signed a previous verification in the case, oh my, he, quote, has been made aware that some of the allegations and evidence proffered by the experts has been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with that knowledge and by incorporation by reference would not be accurate. Nonetheless, on December 31st, the defendant signed the verification, and co-conspirator 2 caused it to be filed. That's perjury. We'll have you now. On January 2nd, Georgia Secretary of State, that's Raffensperger, person 33, appeared on Fox News and said that various rumors of election fraud were false and the defendant had lost in Georgia. And he's quoted here, "Our office has been very busy with what I call the rumor whack-a-mole. Every day a rumor will pop up and then we whack it down. What we do is we basically whack it down with the truth. And people can't handle the truth sometimes because they're very disappointed in the results. And I get that. I voted for President Trump also. But at the end of the day, we did everything we could. We did an audit of the race. President Trump still lost. Then we did a full recount. President Trump still lost. We had a safe, secure process." Person 33, Raffensperger, like person 17, Kemp, had been on the receiving end of the defendant's tweets. These included, "Why isn't the Georgia Secretary of State, Raffensperger, a so-called Republican, allowing us to look at signatures on envelopes for verification? We will find tens of thousands of fraudulent and illegal votes. Rhinos, Kemp, and, person 34, that's a new one, and Secretary of State Raffensperger will be solely responsible for the potential loss of our two great senators from Georgia, persons 27 and 28, Kemp and Loeffler. We won't call a special session or check for signature verification. People are angry. And Georgia, where is the signature verification approval? What do you have to lose? Must move quickly. Kemp and 34. Is that, I forget who. Is that the Attorney General? And, of course, Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger. All addressed, all tagged in this tweet. Shortly after seeing the interview, the defendant set up a call with person 33. That's Raffensperger, I guess, right, to discuss his pending private lawsuit, Trump v. Kemp, in which person 33 was a named defendant. For this reason, 33, Raffensperger, at first hoped to avoid speaking with the defendant, but ultimately acquiesced because the defendant was persistent in seeking to set it up. Also, because of the pending lawsuit, person 33, that's Raffensperger, arranged for his general counsel, person 35, to participate. Joining the defendant on the call were Chief of Staff, person 21, and 3 private attorneys, persons 32 and 36, counsel of record in Trump v. Kemp, and the attorneys whom co-conspirator 2 had emailed about the defendant's false verification. And person 31, whom person 21 introduced on the call as someone who is not the attorney of record but has been involved. One of these is going to be Cleta Mitchell, too. Don't forget about her. The defendant began the call with an animated monologue, no kidding, in which he argued that he had won the election in Georgia, saying, "Okay, thank you very much. Hello, person 33 and 35. And everybody, we appreciate the time in the call." And then he farted a couple times. Don't forget that he did do that. And I don't know, we have that somewhere in here. Did I ever put that back in soundboard? If not, too bad. But it would make for a good punctuation in all of this. All right. Well, anyway, we appreciate the time in the call. So we've spent a lot of time on this. And if we could just go over some of the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia. Throughout the call, the defendant continued to state that he had won and referenced Biden's margin of victory that he needed to overcome to prevail in the state, including by asserting that, quote, "I just want to find 11,780 votes." Wow. He did not reference other elections on the same ballot. After the defendant's opening salvo, person 33 stated, "Well, I listened to what the president has just said. President Trump, we've had several lawsuits, and we've had to respond in court to the lawsuits and the contentions. We don't agree that you have won." The defendant raised multiple false claims of election fraud, each of which Raffensperger, person 33, refuted in turn. When the defendant attacked person 30, called her, quote, "a professional vote scammer and hustler," and mentioned her dozens of times throughout the call, person 33, Raffensperger, said, "You're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that Giuliani or his people, they sliced and diced that video and took it out of context." He then offered the defendant a link to a video disproving the claim, to which the defendant responded, "I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have much," Raffensperger, "I have much better link." Brad, I guess he calls him. "A much better link." He doesn't have anything, but "I don't need your link. I've got a better link," whatever it is we're talking about. Oh, my God. When the defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people had voted in Georgia, Raffensperger said, "Well, Mr. President, the challenge you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were two people that were dead that voted, and so that's wrong. That was 2. When the defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots, Raffensperger, counsel 35, person 35, responded, "We've been going through each of those as well, and those numbers that we've got that Ms. person 31 was just saying, they're not accurate." Maybe that's Cleta. I don't know. At one point, the defendant became frustrated and farted, of course, after both Raffensperger and person 35 explained repeatedly that his claims had been investigated and were not true, and stated, "You're going to find that they are," this is Trump speaking, "and you're going to find that they are," which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did, and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal, that's a criminal offense. And as you know, you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you. And person 35, your lawyer, that's a big risk. What a threat. The call ends with person 35 stating that he would coordinate with the lawyer representing Raffensperger's office in the private lawsuit and get together with person 32 as agreed earlier in the call. The day after the call, January 3rd, the defendant falsely tweeted, "I spoke to Secretary of State Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue." Raffensperger promptly responded in a tweet of his own, "Respectfully, President Trump, what you're saying is not true. The truth will come out." I guess we're getting it now. Want some more? Michigan? This is the way it goes on. Page after page after page. In Michigan, on November 20th, 3 days before Michigan's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment appointing Biden's electors based on the popular vote, the defendant met with person 37 and 38, Michigan's Senate Majority Leader and Speaker of the House, at the Oval Office. Rosalind McGregor knows who they are. The defendant initiated the meeting by asking RNC chairwoman, person 39, Rona Romney McDaniel, to reach out to person 38 and gauge his receptivity to a meeting. The defendant also asked person 39, that's Rona, to participate in the meeting, but Rona told him she had consulted with her attorney and that she could not be involved in a meeting with legislators because it could be perceived as lobbying. After Rona made the first contact on November 18th, the defendant reached out to persons 37 and 38 to extend an invitation. The same day that he contacted persons 37 and 38, the defendant issued a false tweet. "In Detroit, there are far more votes than people. Nothing can be done to cure that giant scam. I win Michigan." What a child. When the defendant called persons 37 and 38 to invite him to the White House, he did not provide the topic of the meeting, but he did ask about allegations of fraud in the election in Michigan. The legislators told him that they and the Michigan legislature were examining the allegations. Both person 37 and 38 assumed that the defendant wanted to see them to discuss claims of election fraud, and they wanted to be firm that they had not seen evidence that would change the outcome of the election. For this reason, and to avoid talking only about election fraud, they prepared materials to raise regarding COVID-19 and planned in advance to release a statement once the meeting was over that said the legislators were unaware of information that would change the outcome of the election. Over the course of the meeting, the defendant dialed in both person 39, that's Rona Romney McDaniel, despite her request not to participate, and Giuliani. Also, person 21 was present for some, but not all of the meeting. After some small talk with the legislators in the Oval Office, the defendant raised various fraud claims, including that he had lost Michigan because of fraud or misconduct in Wayne County, where Detroit is located. Person 37 corrected the defendant and told him he had lost primarily because in two routinely Republican counties, the defendant had underperformed with educated females, and if he had received the same number of votes there as the two winning local sheriffs, he likely would have won Michigan. Person 37 could tell by the defendant's body language that he was not happy to hear person 37's assessment. Notably, the defendant only raised fraud claims to the extent that they affected the outcome of his own race, not for those of other offices in Michigan. Giuliani's participation came after the legislators assured the defendant that they were looking into fraud claims. The defendant dialed Giuliani into the meeting and said, "Rudy, tell them what's going on." Giuliani then launched into a fraud monologue. Finally, person 37 interrupted and asked, "So when are you going to file a lawsuit in Michigan?" A question that Giuliani ignored and did not answer. Immediately after the meeting, persons 37 and 38 released a public statement in which they stated that they had, quote, not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan. On November 21st, the defendant acknowledged persons 37 and 38's statement when he tweeted, "This is true, but for much different than reported by the media." But much different, okay? And implicitly conceded that he had not provided evidence of fraud, yet when he added, "We will show massive and unprecedented fraud." Days later, the defendant's campaign declined to request a statewide recount in Michigan, for which it would have had to pay unless the recount succeeded in changing the outcome of the election, the ultimate deterrent for Donald Trump, right? Despite failing to establish any valid fraud claims, Giuliani followed up with P37 and 38 and attempted to pressure them to use the Michigan legislature to overturn the valid election results. On December 4th, Giuliani sent a message to person 38 claiming that Georgia was poised to do so based on Giuliani and co-conspirator 2's false advocacy there in the December 3rd hearing, and asked person 38 for help. Looks like Georgia may well hold some factual hearings and change the certification under Article 3, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. It did never look like that, of course. As co-conspirator 2 explained, they don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan. It's starting to sound like Eastman, maybe. But okay, we'll check it all out. On December 7th, Giuliani attempted to send person 37 a message and failed because he typed the wrong number into his phone. I wonder who he sent that super secret message to. So I need you to pass, he's saying, it's Giuliani. So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states that the election is in dispute. And that's enclosed in little asterisks there. There's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of the December 8th under Michigan law. Campaign operative person 5 was involved in the drafting of this message with the assistance of person 41, who was associated with the defendant's campaign efforts in Michigan. The following day, Giuliani shared the draft with the defendant, sending it to his executive assistant, person 42, by email. These efforts failed. On December 14th, the day the duly appointed electors across the country met and cast their electoral votes, persons 37 and 38 issued public statements confirming that the defendant had lost Michigan and the legislators still had not received evidence of outcome determinative fraud in their state. Person 37's public statement included, quote, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan." Person 38 stated in part, "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job, but I love our republic too. I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump simply because some think there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason. And that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we'd lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College. And I can't stand for that. I won't." By the way, Donald Trump is back to try to do it again. On January 3rd, the defendant's campaign publicly posted person 37's phone number and attempted to post person 38's, but erred again by one digit in a tweet urging contact Speaker person 38 and Senate Majority Leader person 37. Person 37 received 4,000 text messages in the next 2 hours, forcing him to get a new phone number. Donald Trump is a terrorist. Section 4, Nevada. You can see we're not going to make it probably all through all of these states. I don't know. We'll see if we can squeeze it in. Nevada. On November 17th, in Law versus Whitner, agents of the defendant in Nevada filed suit claiming, quote, substantial irregularities, improprieties, and fraud in the presidential election, including based on machines used in ballot signature matching and votes by non-resident and dead voters. The defendant approved a press conference by his surrogates announcing the suit. On November 19th, person 43, the RNC chief counsel, sent an email to person 44, an RNC spokesperson, warning about the inaccuracies in the suit. Just FYI that I don't believe the claims in the contest regarding dead voters, those voting from out of state, etc., are substantiated. We are working with the campaign on a data matching project, and those numbers are going to be a lot lower than what the Nevada people have come up with. They are also targeting our military voters. To be frank, the contest has little chance of succeeding. Happy to discuss this stuff if you want more info. Person 44 then sent a copy of Person 43's email from her personal email account to the personal email account of Person 45, one of the defendant's White House staffers, who also just happened to volunteer for the campaign. Lots of private emails for an official act. Notwithstanding the RNC chief counsel's warning, the defendant retweeted and amplified news of the lawsuit on November 24th, calling it big news that a Nevada court had agreed to hear it. But the defendant did not similarly promote the fact that within 2 weeks on December 4th, the Nevada District Court dismissed Law versus Whitmer, finding in a detailed opinion that, quote, there is no credible or reliable evidence that the 2020 general election in Nevada was affected by fraud, unquote, including through the signature match machines, and that Biden won the election in the state. 4 days later, on December 8th, Nevada's Supreme Court unanimously affirmed the district court's decision, noting that despite its earlier order asking appellants to identify specific findings with which they take issue, appellants have not pointed to any unsupported factual findings, and we have identified none. Later, in his ellipse speech on January 6th, the defendant repeated multiple claims explicitly rejected by Nevada courts. On December 18th, the Nevada Secretary of State's office released a facts versus myths document to combat disinformation that the defendant and others were propagating about the election, including false claims that the Secretary of State's office had not investigated claims of fraud, even though it had been presented with evidence of widespread fraud, to which the office responded, while we are pursuing action in a number of isolated cases, we have yet to see any evidence of widespread fraud. The Facts versus Myths document also stated publicly that courts had universally rejected fraud claims. 4 separate cases were heard by Nevada judges, including the Nevada Supreme Court. After examining records presented, each case was discounted due to lack of evidence. Section 5 is Pennsylvania. 2 days before the election on November 6th, the defendant called Person 46, the chairman of the Pennsylvania Republican Party, the entity responsible for supporting Republican candidates in the Commonwealth at the federal, state, and local level. Person 46 had a prior relationship with the defendant, including having represented him in litigation in Pennsylvania after the 2016 presidential election. The defendant asked Person 46 how, without fraud, he had gone from winning Pennsylvania on Election Day to trailing in the days afterward. Consistent with what campaign staff had already told the defendant, Person 46 confirmed that it was not fraud. It was that there were roughly 1,750,000 mail-in ballots still being counted in Pennsylvania, which were expected to be 80% for Biden. Over the following 2 months, the defendant spread false claims of fraud in Pennsylvania anyway. In early November, in a campaign meeting, when the defendant suggested that more people in Pennsylvania voted than had checked in to vote, Deputy Campaign Manager Person 3 corrected him. Around the same time, Philadelphia City Commissioner Person 47 appeared on television and stated that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. After seeing the interview, the defendant targeted Person 47, tweeting, "A guy named Person 47, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican Rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win!" As a result of the defendant's attack, threats that Person 47 already was receiving became more targeted and detailed, and included his address and the names of his family members. On the defendant's behalf, Giuliani, too, spread patently false claims about Pennsylvania. On November 25th, Giuliani and Person 12, did we have a Person 12 identification? Jenna Ellis, that's right, attended an unofficial hearing with Republican state legislators in a Gettysburg hotel conference room. At least it wasn't a landscaping place. The defendant called in, claiming to have been watching, and demanded that the election in Pennsylvania has to be turned around. During the event, Giuliani falsely stated that Pennsylvania issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. The claim was rooted in an obvious error, the comparison of the number of ballots sent out in the primary election to the number of ballots received in the general election. After seeing Giuliani make this claim, Person 43, the RNC's chief counsel, tweeted publicly, "This is not true." In the following days, campaign staff internally confirmed that Giuliani was lying. When one campaign staffer wrote in an email that Giuliani's claim was, quote, just wrong and, quote, there's no way to defend it, Person 3, not on our roster at the moment, responded, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating." Likewise, in late November or December, Person 9 informed the defendant directly that a claim that Giuliani was spreading, and Person 9, remember, is Hirschman, a claim that Giuliani was spreading that Pennsylvania received 700,000 more mail-in ballots than were mailed out was, you know what Greg likes to say about these things.
Bullshit.
Right, exactly, thank you, and explained the error. Person 43 followed up on his public tweet in a private email on November 28th to Person 44, the RNC spokesperson, expressing his concern about Giuliani and Person 12, Jenna Ellis, spreading disinformation. I'm really not trying to give you a hard time, but what Giuliani and Ellis are doing is a joke, and they are getting laughed out of court. It's setting us back in our fight for election integrity, and they are misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing. When Giuliani and Person 43, when Giuliani learned of Person 43's tweet and email on November 28th, he called Person 43 and left a threatening voicemail stating, "I really do need an explanation for what you said today, because if there isn't a good one, you should resign. Got it? So call me, or I'll call the boss and get you to resign. Call me. It'll be better for you if you do." Giuliani also contacted RNC chairwoman Ronna Romney McDaniel to demand that Person 43 be fired, and thereafter Person 43 was relieved of his duties as RNC chief counsel. On December 3rd, 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature issued a public letter stating that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and Constitution. Person 48, an agent of the defendant who worked closely with Giuliani, issued a tweet showing the 4 legislators' names and signatures and wrote, "These are the 4 cowardice Pennsylvania legislators that intend to allow the Democrat machine to hashtag steal the vote, hashtag cowards, hashtag liars, hashtag traitors," while linking to the legislators' Twitter accounts on Sunday, December 6th at 12:56 a.m. from the White House residence. Having just returned from a political rally in Valdosta, Georgia, the defendant retweeted and amplified Person 48's post. Wow. Next up, Wisconsin. Number 6. On November 29th, a recount that the defendant's campaign had petitioned and paid for confirmed that Biden had won in Wisconsin and increased the defendant's margin of defeat. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected the campaign's election lawsuit there. As a result, on December 21st, Wisconsin's governor signed a certificate of final determination confirming the prior certificate of ascertainment that established Biden's electors as the valid electors for the state. They actually delayed this until later. Wow, that's amazing. In response, the defendant issued a series of tweets attacking Person 49, the Wisconsin Supreme Court justice who had written the majority opinion rejecting his campaign's lawsuit and advocating that the Wisconsin legislature overturn the valid election results. Now, here comes the attack. But first, remember, didn't Trump just recently say that anybody who attacked the U.S. Supreme Court, like verbally criticized the U.S. Supreme Court, should be in jail, should go to prison? And I suppose you got to go to state penitentiary for criticizing the state Supreme Court, folks. But no, anyway. So let's see. Here's the criticism. 2 years ago, the great people of Wisconsin asked me to endorse a man named P49. for state Supreme Court justice when he was getting destroyed in the polls against a tough Democrat candidate who had no chance of losing. After my endorsement, person 49 easily won. Wow! He just voted against me in a big court decision on voter fraud, of which there was much, despite many pages of dissent from 3 highly respected justices. One thing has nothing to do with another, but we ended up losing 4-3 in a really incorrect ruling. Great Republicans in Wisconsin should take these 3 strong decisions to their state legislators and overturn this ridiculous state election. We won in a landslide. After the defendant's tweet, the state marshals responsible for P49's safety arranged to provide person 49 with additional police protection based on social media traffic and other threatening communications. Now we're on to Section 7 here, voting machines in multiple states. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant and co-conspirators repeatedly made claims about the security and accuracy of voting machines across multiple states, despite the fact that they were on notice that the claims were false. As early as November 12th, for instance, the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and other coordinated federal, state, and private entities issued a public statement declaring that the 2020 election was the, quote, most secure in American history, unquote, and that there was, quote, no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. On November 14th, in the tweet announcing that Giuliani was to lead his campaign legal efforts, the defendant also named co-conspirator 3, and I think that was Sidney Powell, a private attorney who was fixated on voting machine claims, and person 10, another private attorney. 2 days later, on November 16th, on the defendant's behalf, executive assistant person 42 sent Powell and other private attorneys an email titled From POTUS, attaching a document containing bullet points critical of C3. Who is C3 here? Not CC3, but C3. A company, one of the companies, company number 3, that manufactured voting machines used in certain states, and writing, see attached. Please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit. Sidney Powell responded 9 minutes later, writing in all caps here, it must go in all suits in Georgia and Pennsylvania immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside. And now back in normal case here in those states, and machines impounded for nonpartisan professional inspection. On November 17th, person 50, the director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, C-I-S-A, publicly tweeted that a group of private election security experts concluded that claims of computer-based election fraud, quote, have either been unsubstantiated or are technically incoherent. 2 days later, on November 19th, let's see, our codes say Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and Joseph DeGeneva and others held a press conference at the RNC headquarters on behalf of the defendant and his campaign. During it, Sidney Powell made false and factually impossible claims regarding Company 3 and the integrity of the country's election infrastructure. That night, Fox News television personality person 51 stated on air that because of Sidney Powell's incendiary comments about voting machines, he had invited her on to his television program. I got them sued, didn't it? He further stated, but she never sent us any evidence, despite a lot of requests, polite requests, not a page. When we kept pressing, she got angry and told us to stop contacting her. When we checked with others around the Trump campaign, people in positions of authority, they told us that Sidney Powell has never given them any evidence either. She never demonstrated that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately by software from one candidate to another. Not one. The defendant saw his private attorney's RNC press conference and Person 51 discussion of Sidney Powell, and he acknowledged to Person 4 that Sidney Powell had appeared, quote, unhinged in the press conference. On November 20th, the day after the press conference, the defendant made a similar comment to Person 7 and Person 45, two White House staffers who also volunteered for his campaign. Seems like everybody's doing that. In casual conversation after another meeting had ended, the defendant told Person 7 and Person 45 that Person 51 had eviscerated or destroyed Sidney Powell. The defendant then had a call with Sidney Powell on speakerphone while Person 7 and Person 45 listened in and mentioned the Person 51 segment to Sidney Powell. While Powell responded, the defendant placed the call on mute, and to Person 7 and Person 45 mocked and laughed at Sidney Powell, calling her claims crazy, and made a reference to the science fiction series Star Trek when describing her allegations. Okay. In the same time period, when Person 9 told the defendant that Sidney Powell's claims were unreliable and should not be included in lawsuits, the defendant agreed that he had not seen anything to substantiate Powell's allegations. On November 22nd, notwithstanding the defendant's tweet from 8 days prior announcing Sidney Powell's involvement, Rudy Giuliani issued a statement on behalf of the campaign distancing the defendant from Sidney Powell. Sidney Powell is practicing law on her own. She is not a member of the Trump legal team. She is also not a lawyer for the president in his personal capacity. Oh, interesting that they could separate the two at that point, huh? Nonetheless, the defendant continued to support and publicize Sidney Powell's knowingly false claims. For example, within days of Giuliani's statement, the defendant promoted a lawsuit that Sidney Powell was about to file, tweeting on November 24th, "Breaking news. Sidney Powell says her lawsuit in Georgia could be filed as soon as tomorrow and says there's no way there was anything but widespread election fraud. Hashtag MAGA. Hashtag America First. Hashtag Dobbs." Dobbs? All right. Sidney Powell then filed a lawsuit the next day against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging, quote, massive election fraud accomplished through Company 3, election software and hardware. The defendant again promoted the lawsuit in a tweet. The lawsuit was dismissed within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. On December 7th, on November 29th, Person 50, who was no longer the CISA director, for some strange reason, appeared on the television program 60 Minutes. Person 50 stated that he was confident that the election had been secure and, quote, that there was no manipulation of the vote on the machine count side, unquote. In response, the defendant tweeted publicly about Person 50's appearance. 60 Minutes never asked us for a comment about their ridiculous one-sided story on election security, which is an international joke. Our 2020 election, from poorly rated Company 3 to a country flooded with unaccounted for mail-in ballots, was probably our least secure ever. A few days later, Person 10 appeared on the radio program as the defendant's agent, and Person 10 again, Joseph DeGeneva, and said that because of Person 50's comments to promote confidence in the security of the election infrastructure, Person 50, quote, should be drawn and quartered, taken out and shot. Thereafter, Person 50 was subjected to death threats. What do you know? How could that possibly have followed? In a press conference on December 1st, that the defendant acknowledged watching, Person 25, a Georgia election official, decried Person 10, DeGeneva, and the defendant's public statements spreading disinformation and said that if they did not stop, quote, someone is going to get killed. On December 1st, Attorney General Person 52, the Attorney General of the United States, stated publicly that the Justice Department had not seen evidence of fraud sufficient to change the election results. Said still Bill Barr on December 1st. With respect to voting machines, he said, there's been one assertion that would be systemic fraud, and that would be the claim that the machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results, and the DHS and the DOJ have looked into that, and so far, we haven't seen anything to substantiate that. Giuliani and Jenna Ellis, person 12, immediately issued a formal campaign statement attacking, I guess, Bill Barr and the Justice Department, writing, "With all due respect to the Attorney General, there hasn't been any semblance of a Department of Justice investigation. His opinion appears to be without any knowledge or investigation of the substantial irregularities and evidence of systemic fraud." Or systemic. Got it. It was systemic. And, boy, that Jenna Ellis sounds drunk. Anyway, in mid-December, the defendant spoke with RNC chairwoman, person 39, Rona Romney McDaniel, and asked her to publicize and promote a private report that had been released on December 13th that purported to identify flaws in the use of Company 3 machines in Antrim County, Michigan. Rona refused, telling the defendant that she already had discussed the report with person 38, Michigan Speaker of the House, who had told her that the report was inaccurate. Rona conveyed to the defendant that person 38's exact assessment was the report was, quote, effing nuts. How do you like that? Effing nuts. On January 2nd, during the defendant's call with Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger, person 33, Raffensperger said of false claims regarding the voting machines, "I don't believe that you're really questioning the Company 3 machines, because we did a hand retally, a 100% retally of all the ballots, and compared them to what the machines said and came up with virtually the same result. Then we did the recount and we got virtually the same result. So I guess we can probably take that off the table." In response, the defendant falsely claimed that in other states, "We think we found tremendous corruption with Company 3 machines, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see." And then defendant farted again. At the Ellipse on January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators who spoke at the rally continued to make unsubstantiated and false claims about Company 3's machines. Giuliani claimed that in the U.S. Senate runoff election in Georgia the day before, the votes were deliberately changed by the same algorithm that was used in cheating President Trump and Vice President Pence, who I think you should go hang. Co-conspirator number 2 continued the false attack. "We now know, because we caught it live last time in real time, how the machines contributed to that fraud. They put those ballots in a secret folder in the machines, sitting there waiting until they know how many they need. And then the machines, after the close of the polls, we now know who's voted, and we know who hasn't. And I can now, in that machine, match those unvoted ballots with an unvoted voter and put them together in the machine. We saw it happen in real time last night, and it happened on November 3rd as well." In his own speech, the defendant again raised the false specter of the, quote, highly troubling matter of Company 3 and lied about the machines. Oh, yes, right. The highly troubling matter of Company 3. This probably should have been an ending of the quote. "And lied about machines flipping votes from the defendant to Biden in an astronomical and astounding error rate in the machine's ballot scanning." Section D, the defendant organized and caused his electors to submit fraudulent certificates, creating the false appearance that states submitted competing electoral slates. My favorite part. The most astounding, if you ask me. By late November 2020, every effort, both legitimate and illegitimate, that the defendant had made to challenge the results of the election had been unsuccessful. The defendant, his campaign, and their allies had lost or withdrawn one election lawsuit after another in the 7 targeted states. And the defendant and the co-conspirators' efforts to overturn the legitimate vote count through a pressure campaign on state officials and through false claims made directly to state legislators in formal or pseudo hearings continued to fail. So, in early December, the defendant and his co-conspirators developed a new plan regarding the targeted states that the defendant had lost. Again, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. To organize the people who would have served as the defendant's electors had he won the popular vote, and cause them to sign and send to Pence, as president of the Senate, certifications in which they falsely represented themselves as legitimate electors who had cast electoral votes for the defendant. Ultimately, the defendant and his co-conspirators would use these fraudulent electoral votes, merely pieces of paper without the lawful imprimatur of the state executive, to falsely claim that in his ministerial role presiding over the January 6th certification, Pence had the authority to choose the fraudulent slates over the legitimate ones, or to send the purportedly dueling slates to the state legislatures for consideration anew. The fraudulent electors' plan's arc and obstructive purpose is reflected in a series of memoranda drafted in late November and early December by co-conspirator 5, an attorney who volunteered to assist the defendant's campaign in lawsuits challenging the election in Wisconsin. Beginning with a memorandum drafted on November 18th, co-conspirator 5 advocated that the defendant's elector nominees in Wisconsin meet and cast their votes on the date required by the ECA in December. That was December 14th, in 2020 rather, in the event that an ongoing recount in the state reversed the defendant's loss there. But this course of action, which co-conspirator 5's Wisconsin memorandum presented as a contingency plan to preserve the possibility that the defendant's electors' votes be counted at the January 6th certification proceeding if he prevailed in the Wisconsin litigation and won the state, quickly transformed into a corrupt strategy to overturn the legitimate election results. Co-conspirator 5 revealed this obstructive plan in 2 additional memoranda dated December 6th and December 9th, which proposed that the defendant's elector nominees in 6 of the targeted states, all but New Mexico, that is, a state that the defendant lost by more than 10% of the popular vote, by the way, sparsely referenced in his false claims of voter fraud, and did not envision challenging at the inception of the elector scheme, met on December 14th, sign fraudulent certifications, and send them to the vice president to manufacture a fake controversy during the January 6th congressional certification. The defendant personally set the fraudulent elector plan in motion, personally, in early December, and ensured that it was carried out by co-conspirators and campaign agents in the targeted states and monitored its progress. By December 5th, the defendant was starting to think about Congress's role in the election process. For the first time, he mentioned to Pence the possibility of challenging the election results in the House of Representatives. In the same call, Pence told the defendant that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was investigating their race. On December 6th, that same day, co-conspirator 5 put the plan on paper. The defendant and co-conspirator 2 called RNC chairwoman Ronna Romney McDaniel out of the blue. McDaniel did not know co-conspirator 2, and the defendant introduced him to person 39, that's McDaniel, by saying that he was a professor and a lawyer. That's Eastman, I guess. Thereafter, co-conspirator 2 was the primary speaker during the conversation. Co-conspirator 2 told Ronna Romney McDaniel that he and the defendant wanted the RNC, quote, to help the campaign assemble the electors in the states where we had legal challenges or litigation that was ongoing in case any of that litigation changed the result of the state so that it would meet the constitutional requirement of electors meeting. When the call ended, McDaniel immediately called person 3, one of the defendant's deputy campaign managers, and relayed her conversation with the defendant and we guess Eastman there, co-conspirator 2. After person 3 assured McDaniel that the campaign was on it, McDaniel called the defendant back and told him so. On the same day, from his personal email account, person 21 forwarded to campaign staff co-conspirator 5, or 5's November 18th memorandum. I guess that's Cheeseboro, perhaps. Although, I did get a note earlier today, which to you is yesterday, I think from Greg saying that maybe co-conspirator 5 might be Mike Roman, in fact. All right, we'll see if we can't clear that up later on. Anyway, the memorandum said, we just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states. And the following day, on the evening of December 7th, Giuliani sent McDaniel a text message stating in part, I have lawyers assigned in each state working on December 14th electors meeting and what they need. I will send you a list. The defendant's co-conspirators worked with his campaign staff and used his pre-election campaign apparatus to execute the fraudulent elector plan. That is to say, it didn't switch into official mode at any point. It was still campaign staff. Good point. Thank you. The defendant communicated with Giuliani and we think Eastman about the plan, and they in turn communicated with co-conspirator 6 and co-conspirator 5. Ultimately, person 5, person 19, and other campaign staff and agents helped carry out co-conspirator 5's plans. On December 8th, co-conspirator 5 spoke on the phone with person 53, a private attorney whom Giuliani and co-conspirator 6 had identified as a contact for the plan in Arizona. Following the call, person 53 recounted the conversation in an email, and it says, "I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo, co-conspirator 5. His idea is basically that all of us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by the governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by federal law because they're Congress and they make the law, etc." That's some argument. Kind of wild/creative. I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him is that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least. Oh well, you're all going to jail. I.e., we would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing that the fake votes should be counted. That's all. Just doing that, huh? On December 9th, co-conspirator 6 contacted Rona Romney McDaniel for assistance with the request from co-conspirator 5 for, quote, "a list of our electors in each state and copies of the certificates sent in 4 years ago." McDaniel responded that campaign employees were already assisting in that effort and referred co-conspirator 6 to person 3. The next day, at Giuliani's direction, co-conspirator 5 generated directions to the electors in all of the targeted states except for Wisconsin, which had already received his memos, and New Mexico, which had not yet then been asked to do, which he had not yet been asked to do, on how best to mimic the manner in which valid electors were required by state law to gather and vote, along with fraudulent certificates of vote for the defendants' electors to sign. The day before the defendants' electors were scheduled to meet and sign fraudulent certificates of vote, a defendant asked campaign advisor, person 4, for an update on the elector plan and directed person 4 to issue a statement, and Giuliani asked person 4 to participate in a messaging conference call. Person 4 discussed these developments in a text thread with person 3, campaign staffer person 54, and person 9. Do we know person 9 in this? I think, right. Oh, that's Hirschman, the lawyer. Okay, after person 4 proposed a communications plan for the campaign on the elector vote, Hirschman wrote to person 3, "I'll call soon and we'll talk with boss." The participants then discussed to whom a campaign statement should be attributed. Person 3 wrote, "Here's the thing, the way this is morphed, it's a crazy play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it." Person 4 then shared with those on the text thread the invitees to the call Giuliani was convening. Giuliani, co-conspirator 6, person 12, that's Jenna Ellis, person 19, person 55 and person 56, and derogatorily referred to them as the Star Wars bar, meaning a motley assortment of characters, and in this case specifically the ones whose professional competence was doubted by person 4, and whom he personally would not choose to hire. The Star Wars bar. Wow. Person 9 responded, quote, "certifying illegal votes." Okay. Thereafter, the text participants collectively agreed that no message would go out under their names because they can't stand by it. In the midst of those text messages, person 9, person 4, and person 3 had a 19-minute phone call with the defendant. In practice, the fraudulent elector plan played out somewhat differently in each targeted state. In general, the co-conspirators deceived the defendant's elector nominees in the same way that the defendant and co-conspirator 2, Eastman, we think, deceived Rona Romney McDaniel by falsely claiming that their electoral votes would be used only if ongoing litigation were resolved in the defendant's favor. A select few of the defendant's agents and elector nominees, however, had insight into the ultimate plan to use the fraudulent electoral certificates to disrupt the congressional certification on January 6th. In several states, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and agents were unable to convince all of the defendant's elector nominees to participate. Person 57, for instance, a former U.S. representative and U.S. attorney, and one of the defendant's elector nominees in Pennsylvania, who opted out of the plan, told the state party vice chair trying to organize the defendant's electors that he would not participate because the plan did not follow the proper process and was illegal. When electors like person 57 declined, the conspirators and agents had to recruit substitutes willing to go along with the plan. Ooh, don't be that person. Other electors who participated based on their conspirators' false assurances that their votes were only a contingency were later surprised to learn that they were used on January 6th and would not have agreed to participate if the conspirators had been truthful about their plan. But that's the problem with conspirators, isn't it? In Pennsylvania, the defendant's elector nominees' concern about the propriety of the plan presented a problem for the conspirators. In text messages that person 5 and co-conspirator 6 exchanged on December 11th into the early morning hours of December 12th, person 5 told co-conspirator 6 that person 46, the state Republican Party chairman whom the defendant had called shortly after the election, is winding up the electors, telling them if they signed a petition, they could be prosecuted. Need a counter-argument, or someone has to call him and tell him to stop. Even though he's right, apparently. Co-conspirator 6 responded, have someone who knows him call him to tell him to stop. Oh, that did it. Person 5 replied, that's the plan. Pennsylvania is squishy right now. Going to need a call with Giuliani tomorrow. Oh, he'll solve it. On December 12th, Giuliani, co-conspirator 5, co-conspirator 6, and others held a conference call organized by the campaign to placate the defendant's Pennsylvania electors. Giuliani falsely assured them that their certificates of vote would only be used if the defendants succeeded in litigation. During the call, some of the defendants' conspirators and agents exchanged text messages expressing frustration at the electors' concerns. Person 5 wrote, whoever selected this slate should be shot. Person 12, once again, I got to keep checking. Jenna Ellis, these people are making this so much more complicated than it needs to be. OMG. And we couldn't have found 20 people better than this? 3 question marks. Oh, believe me, everybody was better than you, Jenna. Come on. This was the parking lot lawyer, right? P5, or rather the traffic court lawyer. I think Alina Habba was the parking lot lawyer. Anyway, person 5 agreed, writing, we need good substitutes. When the possibility arose that the elector certificates of vote include conditional language making clear that they were not yet the duly appointed electors, person 5 wrote, the other states are signing what co-conspirator 5 prepared. If it gets out that we changed the language for Pennsylvania, it could snowball. On December 13th, the eve of when the electors were to meet, the defendant was preoccupied with preventing the certification of the electoral vote. He tweeted, swing states that have found massive voter fraud, which is all of them, cannot legally certify these votes as complete and correct without committing a severely punishable crime. Everybody knows that dead people, below-age people, illegal immigrants, fake signatures, prisoners, and many others voted illegally. Also, machine glitches, another word for fraud, ballot harvesting, non-resident voters, fake ballots, stuffing the ballot box, votes for pay, roughed-up Republican poll watchers, and sometimes even more votes than people voting took place in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and elsewhere. In all swing state cases, there are far more votes than are necessary to win the state and the election itself. Therefore, votes cannot be certified. This election is under protest. And that's all you need. We protest like a baseball game. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania electors insisted upon using conditional language in their elector certificates to avoid falsely certifying that they were duly appointed electors. And in New Mexico, the state that co-conspirator 5's memoranda did not even address, the defendant's campaign filed a pretextual lawsuit just minutes before the fraudulent electors met, so that there was litigation pending at the time of the vote. Notwithstanding obstacles, the defendant and his co-conspirators successfully organized his elector nominees and substitutes to gather on December 14th in the targeted states, cast fraudulent electoral votes on his behalf, and send those fraudulent votes to Washington, D.C. in order to falsely claim at the congressional certification that certain states had sent competing slates of electors. When possible, the defendant and co-conspirators tried to have the fake electoral votes appear to be in compliance with state law governing how legitimate electors vote. For example, the co-conspirators knew that some states required that the duly appointed electors meet and cast their votes in the state capitol building. To make it seem like they had complied with this requirement, state officials were enlisted to provide the fraudulent electors with access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, the conspirators and fraudulent electors were unable to comply with state law for legitimate electors. For example, Pennsylvania law required the governor to give notice whenever an elector was substituted. But the conspirators could not arrange for the governor to give notice when person 46 and others opted out and had to be replaced. Thereafter, co-conspirator 5 and others brainstormed fake excuses for their failure to follow state law, writing, "Maybe we can use COVID-19 as an excuse for the governor not giving notice." Then, on December 14th, the date that duly appointed electors across the country met to cast their votes, and when the defendant's fraudulent electors in 7 states mimicked them, Ronna Romney McDaniel followed up with the defendant. When she received an internal RNC email titled Electors Recap Final, which summarized the day's activities with respect to electors and included a list of 6, quote, contested states in which the defendant's electors voted, she forwarded it to the defendant's executive assistant, person 42, who responded, "It's in front of him." McDaniel also called the defendant to tell him that she had sent him the update, and she spoke to Giuliani shortly before Giuliani spoke to the defendant. At the same time that the defendant's fraudulent electors were preparing to gather and cast fraudulent votes, the defendant's co-conspirators began planning how to use the fraudulent votes to overturn the election results at the January 6th certification. On December 13th, co-conspirator 5 sent Giuliani a memorandum that envisioned a scenario in which Pence would use the fraudulent slates as a pretext to claim that there were dueling slates of electors from the targeted states and negotiate a solution to defeat Biden. On the same day, the defendant resumed almost daily direct contact with person 1, Bannon, who maintained a podcast that disseminated the defendant's false fraud claims. On December 14th, Bannon's podcast focused on spreading lies about the defendant's fraudulent electors, including the false claim that their votes were merely a contingency in the event the defendant won legal challenges in the targeted states. On December 16th, co-conspirator 5 traveled to Washington with a group of private attorneys who had done work for the defendant's campaign in Wisconsin for a photo opportunity with the defendant in the Oval Office. During the encounter, the defendant complained about Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice, person 49, who 2 days earlier had cast the deciding vote in rejecting the defendant's election challenge in the state. As the group was leaving, the defendant spoke directly and privately to co-conspirator 5. As late as early January, the conspirators attempted to keep the full nature of the fraudulent elector plan secret. On January 3rd, for instance, in a private text message exchange, co-conspirator 6 wrote to co-conspirator 5, quote, "Careful with your texts on text groups. No reason to text things about electors to anyone but co-conspirator 2 and me." Co-conspirator 5 responded, K, like as in okay, and co-conspirator 6 followed up, "I'm probably a bit paranoid, haha." Co-conspirator 5 wrote, "A valuable trait." Well, that is as far as I'm able to bring you today. I know we ran a little bit long and still only got through section D here. There is a section E and a section F still in part 1. Section E has to do with the attempts to persuade Pence to go along with the plan. Section F the events of January 6th and Trump's attempt to take advantage of the unrest, out driving the unrest, and then the attempt to take advantage of it at the Capitol. Those two parts proved to be very revealing as well. Perhaps we can continue with those tomorrow. And then, only then, on to Section 2, the legal argument
From
involved in all of this.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
So, like I said, I took you as far as you can go, as far as 60 pages into it. You've got 60 pages through without having to turn those pages yourself. Time now, though, to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy to take you through the rest of the day. We'll be back tomorrow.